They said the desert wind carried secrets, and that night it carried one more than usual. The lamps flickered along the cracked boardwalks of Dry Creek, a small sunburned village buried deep in the edge of the Arizona frontier. The year was 1887, and folks still wrote their stories in dust and sweat. In that town of cowhands and whiskey breath, where the clang of the blacksmith's hammer mixed with the lonely cry of coyotes, a man named Eli stumbled into something no one could have seen coming, a marriage lottery that would change the shape of his life. Eli wasn't the gambling type. He worked hard, kept to himself, and didn't have much except his horse and the ache of too many empty nights. But sometimes a man gets tired of his own silence. When the sign went up on the general store window, marriage lottery, $5 ticket, winner takes a bride and a homestead, it stirred the whole town like a dust storm through an open barn door. Nobody believed it at first. Folks thought it was some kind of cruel joke, or a trick to pull in money, but curiosity has a way of reaching even the most stubborn men. They said the bride was an orphaned woman from a nearby reservation. The sheriff claimed the county office was behind it, trying to civilize the land, as he called it. The womenfolk whispered that no good could come from selling someone's hand like a bushel of grain. Still, before sundown, 27 men lined up outside the store, each holding a crumpled $5 bill, each hoping maybe this strange lottery would bring them something more than dust and loneliness. Eli didn't plan to be one of them, but he'd just sold a tired old mule for $5 and a handshake, and that sign in the window kept staring at him. He laughed to himself, shook his head, and muttered, "Ain't no woman gonna want a man who smells like horse sweat and coffee." Grounds. But that's the thing about fate. It don't wait for you to be ready. So he bought the ticket. The drawing was held that night at the town saloon, with every man in Dry Creek watching. The piano player hit a sour note just as the sheriff reached into the tin bucket. When he pulled out Eli's number, the room erupted with hoots and slaps on the back. Some laughed, some cursed, and one fella said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Poor soul don't even know what he's won yet." Eli grinned shyly, lifted his hat, and nodded, pretending to be grateful. Truth was, he felt a little dizzy. He didn't know whether to laugh or ride away before morning. But pride's a strong rope. It keeps a man standing even when his knees are weak. The sheriff handed him a paper, signed and sealed, stating that the bride would arrive by stagecoach the following afternoon. She was described only as an Apache woman of uncommon strength and good health. No name, no photograph. Just that line, the crowd murmured uneasily. Folks had their own ways of talking about the Apache, ways that mixed fear with ignorance. By sunrise, the whole town was buzzing. The blacksmith's wife said she'd never heard of an Apache woman marrying a white man, much less through a lottery. The preacher said it was unnatural, but he'd bless the union if the law required. The barkeep said if Eli survived the first night, drinks would be on the house. Eli didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, staring at that folded paper, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks of his small cabin. He thought about what kind of woman she might be. Would she hate him for what had happened? Would she even speak his language? What if she refused the marriage altogether? He rubbed the brim of his hat between his fingers until dawn light spilled through the window. By noon, the stagecoach rumbled into town, coated in red dust. Everyone gathered near the post office to see the so-called bride. Eli stood toward the back, trying to hide the nervous tremble in his hands. The driver climbed down, opened the door, and out stepped a figure that made the whole crowd go silent. She was taller than any woman, or man, Eli had ever seen. Her presence filled the space like thunder fills a canyon, broad-shouldered with dark braids that reached her waist and eyes sharp as desert glass. The sun hit her bronze skin and made it glow like polished copper. She wore a faded cotton dress that couldn't quite hide the muscles of someone who'd known hard work and harder survival. Someone in the crowd whispered, "She's a giant." Another muttered, "That ain't natural." But Eli said nothing. He just stared. There was no cruelty in her face, but no softness either. Just a deep calm, like the stillness before a storm. The sheriff cleared his throat, holding the papers high. "Miss," he said, addressing her awkwardly, "this man here won the marriage contract fair and legal. You are to be joined according to the terms set forth by the county." She looked at Eli, really looked, and he felt it like a weight pressing down on his chest. Her eyes held stories older than the town, older than the white fences and the saloons. She didn't speak, only nodded once, slow and deliberate. The preacher stepped forward, mumbling his blessing, but no one really heard it. The crowd was too busy whispering, measuring her size, her silence, her defiance. Eli caught the faintest hint of a scar near her collarbone and wondered what kind of life had carved it there. When the ceremony ended, the people dispersed, still talking in low voices. Eli led her to his horse and offered her a ride. She refused, walking beside him instead, her long strides keeping pace easily. The trail to his cabin wound through stretches of pale sand and lonely cactus. Neither spoke for nearly an hour. At last, Eli said, "You don't have to stay if you don't want to." She stopped, turning her face toward him. The wind tugged at her hair. "You bought a name," she said softly, her English heavy with accent. "Not my spirit." Her words hit him harder than a bullet. He opened his mouth to reply, but the desert swallowed his voice. When they reached the cabin, she paused at the doorway, her head nearly brushing the top beam. She looked around the small rough space, the single bed, the hanging pots, the cracked window, and for the first time, Eli saw something flicker in her eyes. Not fear, not anger, something deeper, maybe grief, maybe memory. That night she sat by the fire while Eli chopped wood outside, too restless to be still. The moon rose cold and white over the desert. Coyotes cried in the distance. He could see her shadow move through the window, tall, steady, silent. He wondered if she'd ever smile, if she'd ever forgive the world that put her here like a prize in a cruel game. As he set down the axe, he noticed something glinting behind the woodpile, a piece of broken metal half buried in the sand. He picked it up. It was an old medallion, engraved with tribal markings he didn't understand. On the back, faint words were scratched in English, "For those left behind." Eli turned toward the cabin, suddenly uneasy. Inside, the firelight flickered. The woman, his so-called wife, was staring at him through the window, her expression unreadable, her eyes reflecting the flames. And for the first time, Eli realized he hadn't just won a marriage lottery. He'd stepped into something much older, much darker, something that didn't care about laws or money or men's foolish games. The wind rose again, moaning through the cracks like a warning. Somewhere out in the desert, a drumbeat echoed faintly in the night. Eli looked toward the horizon, then back at the woman who sat by his fire. Whatever fate he'd bought for $5, it had only just begun. The next morning came quiet and strange. The desert sky blushed pale gold over the hills, and the air was cool enough that Eli could see his breath drift in front of him. He stepped outside the cabin, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and found her already awake, standing by the water trough, her hands and forearms glistening as she washed. She didn't say a word, and neither did he. She moved with a slow grace, steady and certain, like she belonged to the land itself. Eli had never known what to do with silence, but hers wasn't empty. It was heavy, like it carried the weight of things he couldn't name. He tried to speak a few times, to offer coffee or breakfast, but the words stayed tangled in his throat. She didn't look at him, just tied her braids back, then began gathering sticks for the fire as though she'd lived there all her life. He watched her quietly, wondering what her story was. The sheriff had said only that she came from a reservation a few days' ride south, but even that didn't sit right with him. Something about the way she carried herself, too proud, too distant, told Eli she hadn't come willingly. He went back inside, poured coffee into 2 tin mugs, and placed one on the table for her. When she finally stepped in, she didn't hesitate. She sat across from him, her eyes steady, her shoulders squared. The firelight danced against her face, showing the faint marks of old scars near her temple. "You can call me Eli," he said finally. She didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the desert stretched endless and empty. "I had a name," she said quietly, before they took it. He didn't know what to say. The words hit him harder than he expected. After a long silence, she added, "You can call me what you wish. That is what they told you, yes?" Eli set his cup down. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I don't own you." Her eyes flickered, not quite softening, but something changed. Something small, like the first crack in a wall. The day passed slowly. Eli worked on repairing the corral fence while she cleaned the cabin and tended to the small patch of dry earth where he'd tried, without much luck, to grow corn. She didn't ask for help, and he didn't offer. By evening, the place already looked different, tidier, almost lived in. When the sun dipped low, painting everything in deep orange light, Eli saw her kneel in the dirt near the edge of the yard. She took a small pouch from her dress and sprinkled something onto the ground, tiny grains, maybe seeds. Then she pressed her palm flat to the soil and whispered words he didn't understand. He stepped closer, careful not to startle her. "What are you doing?" he asked. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Calling back what was taken," she said simply. He nodded like he understood, though he didn't. That night, the air turned colder, and the coyotes' cries came closer to the cabin. Eli lay awake on his cot listening to the fire crackle. The sound of her breathing from across the room was slow and steady, but somehow he could feel her wakefulness, like she too was waiting for something. He thought again about the medallion he'd found by the woodpile, the one marked with strange carvings. He pulled it from his pocket, tracing the design with his thumb. "For those left behind," it had said. But who had left it there? And what did it mean? Just as he was turning it over again, a low hum filled the air. It wasn't the wind. It was deeper, rhythmic, like a distant chant. Eli sat up, his heart thudding. The woman stirred too, her eyes opening immediately, alert. "You hear that?" he whispered. She didn't answer, only rose to her feet and walked to the window. The sound was faint, coming from the far edge of the desert, steady and pulsing like a heartbeat. Then after a moment it faded, leaving only the stillness of the night. She turned back toward him. "They are watching," she said. "Who?" Eli asked. She didn't reply. She just sat back by the fire, her face lit with that same quiet calm that unnerved him. He wanted to press for answers, but something in her eyes told him not to. The next few days passed in uneasy rhythm. They spoke little, but a strange understanding began to form between them. She helped with chores, fixed the broken latch on the door, even mended his torn shirt without being asked. Eli found himself watching her more than he should. Her strength, her silence, the way she seemed to listen to things no one else could hear. Still, the town hadn't forgotten. By the end of the week, a wagon rolled up to Eli's cabin. It was Tom Hensley, the storekeeper, and two others. They brought supplies and plenty of questions. "Just making sure you're still alive out here," Tom said with a forced laugh. "Folks been talking, you know. They say she don't sleep, that she don't eat much. That true?" Eli crossed his arms. "She's fine. We both are." Tom looked around nervously. "Well, sure, but some of the boys are saying maybe it ain't right. Sheriff's thinking he ought to check the papers again, make sure everything was done legal." Eli's jaw tightened. "It's legal." Before Tom could reply, the cabin door opened. She stepped out, tall and silent, her eyes locking on the men. The air shifted instantly. Even Tom, who'd been running his mouth, fell quiet. She didn't speak, only looked at them, long enough that they started shifting their feet. Then she turned and walked back inside without a word. Tom cleared his throat, muttered something about leaving, and climbed back into the wagon. As they rode away, Eli heard him whisper to the others, "Told you. She ain't natural." That night, the unease returned. Eli sat by the fire thinking about what Tom said. The truth was he didn't understand her either. She seemed to know things before they happened. Once, when he was out chopping wood, she warned him not to fell a certain tree. Hours later, lightning struck it during a storm. She never explained how she knew. Another evening, he found her standing barefoot in the cold dirt, looking toward the horizon. He followed her gaze and saw faint lights flickering out there, tiny fires burning far off in the desert. "Who are they?" he asked. Her voice was low. "People who remember." He didn't dare ask more. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, Eli began to notice little changes. The patch of ground where she had planted those seeds began to sprout, small green shoots pushing through the dry soil. No one had ever made anything grow there before. Even the air felt different around the cabin, calmer somehow. But there were nights when she grew restless. She'd pace near the door, eyes sharp, listening for sounds he couldn't hear. Once she told him not to light the lantern. "Light draws the wrong kind," she murmured. He didn't ask what kind she meant. Then one night, a horse approached from the distance. Eli went outside, hand on his rifle, and saw the sheriff riding up, face pale in the moonlight. "Eli," he called, dismounting. "We need to talk." Inside, the woman sat still, watching from the shadows. The sheriff glanced toward her, then back at Eli. "We got trouble. Couple cattlemen found a burned wagon 5 miles south of town. Driver gone. Only thing left was a piece of jewelry. Looked Apache." Eli frowned. "You think she had something to do with it?" The sheriff sighed. "Don't know what to think, but folks are scared. They say her people been moving closer. If there's a raid brewing, I gotta know whose side you're on." Eli's stomach knotted. "There ain't no sides here. She's my wife and we're minding our own business." The sheriff lowered his voice. You better hope it stays that way. Then he tipped his hat and rode off, leaving a trail of dust behind. Eli went back inside. She was still sitting there, unmoving, her dark eyes catching the firelight. They will come, she said softly. Who? He asked again. She looked toward the door. The ones who never forget. Her words hung in the air like a shadow. Outside, the coyotes had gone silent, and in that stillness, Eli felt something shift in the earth beneath them, like the desert itself was holding its breath. He looked down at the medallion still in his pocket, feeling its strange weight. He didn't know what kind of story he'd stumbled into, but he knew it was far from over, and somewhere out in that endless stretch of sand, the faint rhythm of drums began again, slow, steady, and getting closer. The days that followed grew heavier, as if the desert itself knew something was coming. The wind blew hotter, sharper, carrying a strange smell like smoke and iron. Eli tried to keep busy, patching fences, fixing the roof, anything to keep his mind from circling the same questions. Who was watching them? What did she mean when she said they will come? And what kind of danger had followed her to his door? The woman didn't talk much, but her silence spoke louder now. Every morning she'd walk out past the edge of the property, where the earth dropped into dry ravines, and stand there for a long while, staring at the horizon. Once Eli followed her and saw her kneel by a cluster of stones. She whispered something he couldn't understand, and left a handful of corn seeds there before turning back. When he asked what she was doing, she said, feeding the forgotten. He didn't press her for more. He'd learned by now that some answers only led to darker questions. Back in town, the talk had turned mean. Men who once slapped Eli on the back now crossed the street when they saw him coming. The preacher's wife whispered that a curse had fallen over his land. Even the blacksmith, who'd been his friend for years, warned him quietly to keep a watch on that woman. Eli didn't blame them. Fear made fools out of everyone, and Dry Creek was a place that thrived on stories. The way people saw it, no good ever came from mixing with the Apache. Not after the border raids and old blood debts that no one really remembered but everyone still talked about. Still, it ate at him. He'd lived his life by the rules of hard work and simple truth, but now those truths felt uncertain. He couldn't deny what he saw. Her strange calm during the storms, the way the land seemed to answer to her, and how she could walk into the desert at dusk and return before dawn without a trace of exhaustion. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Eli finally asked, "What are you waiting for out there? When you stand looking toward the hills?" She didn't look at him right away. Her gaze stayed fixed on the flames. "You hear the drums at night?" He nodded slowly. "They are not calling you," she said. "They are calling me. They ask what I've become." Eli swallowed hard. "And what do you tell them?" Her eyes lifted to his, dark and still. "Nothing yet." The fire popped, sending sparks into the air. Outside, the wind moaned through the cracks in the wall. For a long time, neither spoke again, but Eli couldn't shake the feeling that whatever she was keeping quiet about would soon reach them both. That week, strange things began to happen. His horse refused to leave the stable, snorting and kicking whenever Eli tried to saddle it. Coyotes started gathering at the edge of the property at night, not howling, just watching with gleaming eyes. And one morning he found a circle of stones arranged perfectly behind the cabin, stones he swore hadn't been there before. He asked her about it. She only said, "They mark where safety ends." Eli didn't know whether to laugh or worry, but deep down, something cold settled in his gut. The next day, the sheriff came back, this time with 2 deputies. Dust clouded behind their horses as they rode up. Eli met them outside, his jaw tight. "Eli," the sheriff said, tipping his hat, "I need to ask your wife some questions." "She ain't done nothing," Eli said firmly. "This ain't about that burned wagon no more," the sheriff replied. "There's been another one found. Same signs, tracks leading west, then vanishing into the desert. Folks are scared. They think maybe she's sending signals." "Signals?" Eli frowned. "To her people," the sheriff said quietly. "Maybe she's calling them in." Before Eli could answer, the door opened. She stood there, tall and calm, her expression unreadable. The deputies stepped back slightly. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, "just need to know where you've been riding these last few nights." "I do not ride," she said flatly. The sheriff nodded slowly, uneasy. "You mind if I take a look around?" Eli's temper flared. "You got a warrant?" The sheriff sighed. "Don't make this harder than it's gotta be, Eli. Folks are ready to take things into their own hands. I'm trying to keep peace. She stepped forward then, her voice low but steady. Peace is not yours to keep. For a moment the air seemed to hum. Even the horses shifted nervously. The sheriff looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Then he backed away. Fine, he muttered. But if anything else happens, I can't promise the town will wait for answers. When they rode off, Eli turned to her, his hands shaking slightly. You're making enemies you don't even see, he said. She looked at him, her face unreadable. They already decided what I am. He didn't argue. He couldn't. That night, thunder rolled far off in the distance. Eli lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The drums came again, closer this time, steady and deliberate. Then came another sound, a voice, faint, almost carried by the wind. It wasn't English. It was deeper, older. He sat up, heart pounding, and saw her standing in the doorway, silhouetted by lightning. Her long braid hung over her shoulder, and her eyes glowed faintly in the flash. Don't go out there, he said. But she didn't listen. She stepped out into the storm, barefoot, her dress whipping in the wind. Eli followed her, shouting over the thunder, but when he reached the edge of the clearing, she was gone. He searched for her for hours, calling her name, following her tracks through the wet sand. When the rain finally stopped and dawn began to break, he saw her walking back from the ravine. She was soaked but calm, her hands covered in mud. What happened? He asked. She looked at him with that same quiet strength. They took back one of their own, Eli frowned. Who? She didn't answer, only brushed past him and went inside. Later that day, a rider came from town with grim news. A local rancher had gone missing. His wagon had been found overturned in the same area the woman had come from. The townsfolk were already gathering near the church, talking about forming a posse. Eli's stomach sank. He didn't know what was truth anymore. That evening, he found her sitting outside, staring at the horizon again. The setting sun painted her face in gold and red. He sat beside her, unsure what to say. They won't stop, he said finally. They think you're the reason for all this. She didn't move. They think what they need to think. The desert has its own justice, he turned to her. If you know something, you need to tell me. I can't keep defending what I don't understand. She looked at him then, her expression softer than he'd ever seen. Long before you were born, she said, men came to our villages and promised peace. They brought papers and guns and said the land would be shared. But peace is never given, it is taken away. The drums you hear are the ones who remember that taking. Eli listened quietly. The truth of it settled over him like dust. So you came here because of them? He asked. I came because they chose me to carry what's left, she said. But I didn't know they would follow. Eli stood slowly, looking out at the empty land, the fading sun, the distant hills that now seemed less still than before. Then what happens when they do? She met his eyes. You will have to decide who you stand with. That night the drums didn't fade. They grew louder, joined by faint shouts carried on the wind. Eli sat by the window, rifle across his lap, listening as the desert came alive with unseen movement. Shadows flickered between the hills, and every now and then, he thought he saw shapes, tall figures standing still against the moonlight. Inside, she sat by the fire, humming something low and ancient, her eyes closed. The sound of it sent chills down his spine. When he looked out again, the lights from the town glimmered far in the distance, tiny and weak. Between here and there stretched miles of dark waiting land. He didn't know whether the danger was coming from the desert or from the men who feared it. Either way, it was coming. And as the wind rose, carrying that deep rhythm of drums and whispers, Eli realized something he'd been avoiding since the day she arrived. The woman he'd won for $5 wasn't the one who needed saving. It was him. The night came heavy and strange, thick with dust and electricity. The wind had gone still, as if even the desert was waiting for something. Eli sat by the window with his rifle across his knees, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The drums hadn't stopped all evening. They rolled like distant thunder, deep and steady, coming from somewhere beyond the dark ridges. The sound was closer now, so close he could almost feel it in his chest. The woman, his wife, though that word had never felt right, sat by the fire, her hands resting on her knees. Her face was calm, but her eyes were distant, locked on something he couldn't see. Every so often she would murmur words in a language that sounded like the desert itself was speaking through her. Eli's mind raced. He thought about the sheriff, the townsmen, the fear growing in Dry Creek. He knew it wouldn't be long before someone did something foolish. And if they came out here tonight, it wouldn't be to talk. He turned to her finally. If they come, will your people fight? She didn't answer right away. The fire popped, sending sparks upward. They will not fight, she said at last. They will reclaim. Reclaim what? He asked. She lifted her gaze to him, her voice quiet but sure. What was taken? The land, the bones, the names. Eli swallowed hard. And what happens to us? Her eyes softened for the briefest moment. You are part of it now, whether you wanted to be or not. Outside, the air shifted again. The horses in the corral began to whinny and stamp their hooves. The sound sent a chill up Eli's spine. He rose and stepped out onto the porch, scanning the open land. The moon hung low and full, bathing everything in silver light. At first he saw nothing, just sand, cactus, and long stretches of black shadow. Then in the distance he saw movement, figures, a slow line of them walking silently across the flats. He gripped the rifle tighter. They're here, he muttered. Behind him she stepped out, her tall frame silhouetted against the doorway. She didn't look afraid. If anything, she looked expectant. They will not harm you if you stay behind the line of stones, she said. Eli glanced down. The ring of stones she had arranged weeks ago circled the cabin like a strange fence. You mean this? She nodded. It is a boundary. It tells them this place is under watch. He looked back at the horizon. The figures were getting closer, too many to count. The faint glint of torches flickered among them, and the drums grew louder, echoing through the ravines like a heartbeat from the earth itself. A horse's distant cry cut through the air. Eli's breath came quicker. What are they coming for? He asked. She didn't answer. Her gaze stayed fixed on the approaching line. You'll see soon. Eli felt sweat trickle down his neck despite the cool night air. His mind spun with questions, with fear, with the urge to run. But where would he go? The town was 10 miles east, and he'd be a fool to think they'd welcome him there now. He looked at her again, standing tall and silent, her hair whipping in the wind that had suddenly returned. She didn't flinch as the sound of the drums filled the valley. Minutes felt like hours. The shapes in the distance grew clearer. Men and women walking in step, faces hidden in shadow. None carried weapons that he could see, but their presence felt powerful, ancient. Then, from the opposite direction, another sound broke the night. A gunshot. Then another. Eli froze. The sharp echo came from the ridge behind them. He turned and saw torchlight glinting off metal. Riders. It was the townsmen. The sheriff's posse, maybe 20 strong, were cutting across the ridge with rifles drawn. Their voices carried over the wind, shouts of anger, fear, the kind of wild noise men make when they're already half lost to it. Eli's stomach twisted. They were riding straight toward the line of stones. The woman turned her head slightly, eyes narrowing. They should not cross that, she said. They don't know, Eli said quickly. They think they're protecting the town. Her expression darkened. The desert protects itself. He stepped toward her. Please, there's got to be another way. Let me talk to them. But she didn't move. She raised her hands slowly, palms open to the wind, and began to chant under her breath. The sound was low and strange, like a hum that rose from the ground. Eli felt it under his boots, a vibration, faint at first, then stronger. The air around the cabin seemed to thicken. The horses out back neighed wildly, slamming against the corral fence. Stop, Eli said, his voice shaking. You'll bring them down on us. She didn't hear him or didn't care. The chant grew louder, the firelight behind her flaring high enough to throw long shadows across the sand. Eli turned and ran toward the ridge, waving his arms. Don't shoot, he shouted. Stay back. Don't cross the line. But his voice was drowned out by the wind and the sound of hooves pounding the ground. The sheriff was at the front, rifle raised. Eli, he shouted. Step aside. We're taking her in. You can't, Eli yelled. You don't understand. A gunshot cracked. Eli flinched as the bullet hit the dirt near his feet. The sheriff's face was pale and tight. She's bringing them here, Eli. We saw the fires. You want to die for her, fine, but you ain't taking this town with you. Before Eli could answer, the wind roared like something alive. The line of Apache figures had reached the edge of the clearing. They stopped just outside the stones, their faces still hidden, torches burning low. The air between the two groups shimmered like heat rising off the ground. The sheriff's horse reared, spooked by the noise. Someone shouted and another rifle fired. The sound was deafening in the open night. Then the fire from the torches shifted, flaring brighter, redder. Eli turned and saw the woman step forward, her eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. The chant rolled from her lips deep and steady, and the ground began to tremble. The sheriff's men froze, some shouting, some crossing themselves. Eli could feel the energy in the air, thick, vibrating, pulling at him. "Stop!" he shouted again, running toward her. "You'll make them think it's an attack." But when he reached her, he saw her tears. They glistened in the flicker of firelight as she whispered, "It already was." A loud crack split the air. One of the men had fired again, and the bullet struck the ground near her feet. She didn't move. Instead, she raised her arms higher, and the torches of the approaching figures all flared in unison, their light merging into one burning glow that painted the desert red. The wind howled through the valley, whipping up sand until it stung Eli's face. He could barely see now, just shapes moving in the storm, voices shouting, the sharp cry of horses, the deep rumble of drums pounding faster and faster. Through it all, she stood still, her voice rising above the chaos. The words she spoke weren't English, but they carried meaning even he could feel, something about loss, about justice, about remembering. And then, suddenly, silence. The wind stopped. The drums ceased. Even the fire seemed to still. For a moment, the desert was perfectly quiet. The sheriff's men sat frozen in their saddles. The Apache figures stood motionless, their torches now dim. Eli turned to her, breathing hard. "What did you do?" Her face was wet with tears, her voice barely a whisper. "I told them to wait." "For what?" She looked past him, toward the town miles away, where faint lights glimmered under the horizon. "For the truth to reach them. For the debt to be remembered." Eli followed her gaze. In the distance, lightning flickered across the sky, illuminating the desert for a heartbeat. And in that flash he saw something that made his blood run cold. Shapes, hundreds of them, stretching far into the plains beyond sight. Whatever was coming, it wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. He turned back to her, desperate. "Tell me what I can do." She met his eyes with a look both fierce and sorrowful. "Stand where the stones end," she said quietly. "And when they come, choose who you'll face, the living or the dead." The wind rose again, carrying the scent of rain and smoke. And as the first drops began to fall on the dry earth, Eli realized that the night was about to decide everything, the land, the town, and the strange, impossible bond between him and the woman he'd won for $5. The desert held its breath. The drums began again, slow and steady, and somewhere out there the horizon started to move. The storm broke with a sudden crash of thunder that shook the ground. Rain poured over the dry land, soaking into the thirsty earth and washing the dust from the air. Eli stood at the edge of the ring of stones, his rifle heavy in his hands, staring into the storm as lightning flashed over the plains. The line of Apache figures stood motionless, their torches snuffed out by the rain, while the townsmen on the ridge were shouting, confused and frightened. The world seemed caught between two moments, waiting for someone to move first. The woman stood beside Eli, her long hair plastered to her face by the rain, her eyes still locked on the horizon. "It's done," she said softly. Eli looked at her, trying to understand. "What's done?" "The desert has heard," she replied. "It will take what it needs and leave what must remain." He shook his head, not sure what she meant, but he could feel something shifting around them. The tension that had filled the night was beginning to ease, like a bowstring being slowly unstrung. The wind softened, the lightning faded, and in the distance the steady beat of drums began to fade into silence. The riders on the ridge didn't move for a long while. The sheriff sat on his horse, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, staring down at the cabin. He looked tired, older somehow, as if the storm had taken something from him too. Finally, he raised his hand. "Let's go home," he called. The men hesitated, uncertain, but one by one they turned their horses and rode back toward town. The sound of hooves faded into the distance, swallowed by the rain. Eli lowered his rifle. His hands were shaking, though he wasn't sure if it was from fear or relief. When he looked toward the plain again, the figures that had been standing there were gone. No sound, no sign they had ever been there, only the wet desert and the smell of rain. He turned to the woman, but she had already stepped down into the mud, her bare feet silent as she walked toward the ring of stones. She knelt and touched one of them, whispering something under her breath. Then she straightened and looked back at him. "You can rest now," she said softly. Eli frowned. "Rest? What do you mean?" "The land will sleep again," she said. "You helped it remember." He didn't fully understand her words, but there was peace in her voice. She turned toward the open desert, her face lit faintly by the last flicker of lightning. For the first time since he'd met her, She looked free. Eli stepped closer. "Where will you go?" "Home," she said simply. "Where my people are waiting," he hesitated.
"Will I ever see you again?"
She smiled faintly, her eyes warm but distant. "You will see me in the rain, in the wind that moves across the grass. You'll know I'm there when the land breathes easy again." Something inside him ached at her words. He wanted to tell her to stay, to ask her to share this small, strange life he'd built out here. But he knew he couldn't hold her. She belonged to something far older and stronger than he did. He nodded slowly. "Then I'll keep this place safe," he said. "I'll take care of the land." Her eyes softened. That's all it ever wanted. With that, she turned and walked into the storm. The rain swallowed her silhouette, and before long she was gone, vanished into the dark horizon. Eli stood there a long time, watching, until the last echo of thunder faded. When morning came, the desert looked new. The rain had carved small rivers through the dust, leaving everything clean and bright. The cabin still stood, the line of stones unbroken, and the world felt strangely quiet, as if it were catching its breath. Eli stepped outside with a cup of coffee and looked over the land. He could still hear faint traces of the night before, the drums, the wind, her voice. But they felt like memories now, half dream, half truth. In the days that followed, things in Dry Creek began to change. The sheriff came by once just after sunrise. He didn't say much, only that the townsfolk were uneasy but alive, and that no one wanted trouble anymore. The fires on the hills had gone out, and no one had seen the strange light since that night. The land, once dry and cracked, now shimmered with small green shoots pushing through the soil. "Whatever happened out here," the sheriff said quietly, "it's done some good." Eli only nodded. Maybe it's what the land needed. The sheriff tipped his hat and rode off, leaving Eli alone again. Weeks passed. Life slowly returned to its old rhythm. He mended fences, tended to the horses, and fixed the roof the storm had torn loose. But something inside him had changed. He started to notice things he hadn't before. The way the wind carried the scent of wildflowers after rain, the soft hum of insects at dusk, the warmth that lingered in the soil when he worked it with his hands. It felt as if the land itself had opened up to him, sharing its secrets in small, quiet ways. Sometimes at night, he would sit on the porch and stare at the horizon. When the wind blew just right, he thought he could hear her voice carried across the plains, soft and steady, like the rhythm of the drums. He would smile and close his eyes, knowing she was still out there somewhere. The people in town started to change too. The farmers spoke of better harvests, and the well that had been dry for years began to fill again. The air felt lighter, as if the weight that had hung over Dry Creek for generations had finally lifted. One evening, a young boy came riding up from town with a sack of grain. He handed it to Eli, grinning. "Pa said to give you this. Said it's from the land's kindness." Eli smiled. "Then tell your pa to thank the land, not me." The boy tilted his head. "How do you thank the land?" Eli looked out at the horizon, thinking. "By listening to it," he said. "By not taking more than it gives." The boy nodded, thoughtful, then rode back toward town. Eli watched him go, the smile still on his face. That night, as the sun set, the desert glowed gold and red, the sky wide and endless. Eli stood by the fence, his hat in his hands, and whispered a quiet thank you to the wind. Somewhere far off, he thought he saw movement. Just a flicker of white cloth, the shape of a woman walking among the shadows. But he didn't call out. Some things weren't meant to be chased. The seasons turned. The rain came and went, and the desert bloomed brighter than it had in years. The people of Dry Creek learned to live a little closer to the land, to listen a little more. And though no one spoke of that strange night openly, everyone felt the change it had left behind. For Eli, life became simpler. He found peace in small things. The sound of the creek after rain, the warmth of sunlight on his porch, the comfort of knowing the land he lived on was finally at rest. Sometimes he would sit alone beneath the stars and think about how strange it was that he'd once thought himself alone in the world. He realized now that no one truly is. The land remembers every step, every story, every promise, and when the wind swept through the valley, rustling the dry grass, it always seemed to carry a voice, soft, patient, and full of life. In that sound, Eli heard everything that mattered: forgiveness, belonging, and the simple truth that every place, every heart can heal if given enough time. The land was alive again, and so was he. The story of Dry Creek, of the woman and the man who found each other at the edge of the desert, faded into legend over the years. But the people still say that when the storms come, you can hear the drums rolling over the plains, steady and calm, as if the earth itself were remembering. And somewhere out there, beneath the endless western sky, the wind carries their names, two souls bound not by fear or anger, but by the quiet strength of love, land, and forgiveness. The desert sleeps in peace once more.